Ghislaine recognized that Vanessa's past madness was driven not just by an improper, self-taught mana training method, but by the emotional wounds inflicted upon her by the world. Determined to rewrite her tragic fate, Ghislaine planned to teach her the correct mana training technique and closely oversee her progress. While time was too tight for her to naturally accumulate a massive pool of mana, he already had a separate, secret plan in motion to address that limitation. Satisfied with securing his future trump card and wrapping up his business, Ghislaine bid farewell to the Crimson Flame Tower, promising to return with the runestone once his estate stabilized. The Tower Master and the Elders were visibly thrilled to see Ghislaine leave. However, when Hubert clumsily offered a polite social invitation to stay and tour the city, Ghislaine intentionally toyed with them by pretending to accept, sending the mages into a brief, panicked frenzy before ultimately declining. Ghislaine left strict instructions for Vanessa to be treated as an honored guest and protected until she was sent to his estate separately to prevent rumors. Down in the lobby, the handoff of the gold coins took a chaotic turn when the mercenaries counted the payment and discovered it was short by 3 gold coins, deeply embarrassing the proud mages. The mystery was quickly solved when Gordon silently pulled 5 stolen gold coins out from his groin area and tossed them into the box. Realizing that both Gordon had stolen money and the mercenaries had miscounted the total, an enraged Kara dragged Gordon to a corner and thoroughly beat him for his incompetence. Shrugging off the crude display, Ghislaine offered a half-hearted apology for his uneducated men and quickly led his group out of the tower. On the road back, Kyra questioned why Ghislaine had taken a seemingly useless maid as his personal mage, but Ghislaine merely offered a knowing smile, keeping his future knowledge to himself. Meanwhile, back at the Ferdium estate, Chief Overseer Baron Homern had spent an anxious month worrying that the young lord had been killed by bandits. Just as Homern was setting out with a tiny search party to look for him, a massive cloud of dust revealed Ghislaine returning at the head of hundreds of heavily armed, well-equipped men. When Ghislaine revealed that he had preemptively hired this entire private army of mercenaries to clear the forest of beasts and defend against inevitable territorial invasions, Homern completely panicked, arguing that no enemy lord would attack for at least a year. The final blow landed when Homern asked how much of the runestone profits remained. Ghislaine calmly admitted that he had spent every single penny on the army and supplies, leaving the heartbroken chief overseer clutching his head and on the verge of fainting. Homern clutched his forehead and swayed on the verge of fainting, completely overwhelmed by the news that Ghislaine had spent every single penny of the runestone profits on mercenaries and supplies. A nearby knight quickly caught the staggering chief overseer, whose legs wobbled as he bitterly lamented the waste of funds on what he believed were useless soldiers. Homern passionately argued that the money should have been spent on improving their own knights and military forces, insisting that 300 extra mercenaries would make no difference in a true territorial war. He believed a wiser political move would have been offering partial control of the runestones to a powerful lord in exchange for protection, rather than risking complete ruin. Ghislaine tried to soothe his despair by revealing he had saved 5,000 gold for his father and would soon secure more runestones. But Homern was too deeply disappointed to listen. Convinced the young lord could not be trusted with finances, the sorrowful official staggered back into the castle. Moments later, an extravagant, grand carriage drawn by 8 white horses arrived at the estate, carrying the mages from the Crimson Flame Tower. Alfoy arrogantly mocked Ghislaine's noble dignity upon stepping out, drawing a sigh from the young lord, who was highly annoyed that the mages had completely ignored his strict orders to arrive quietly and discreetly. When a dazed Homern asked about the robed newcomers, Ghislaine casually lied and called them mercenaries, causing the exhausted overseer to dismissively tell them to go enjoy their war games before heading inside. Ghislaine then checked on Vanessa, ensuring she had arrived safely without being mistreated, and tasked Belinda with showing the mages to their quarters while he managed the mercenaries. As the mages strolled through the courtyard pretentiously praising the castle's classical architecture, Ghislaine noticed that they were forcing Vanessa to single-handedly unload all of their heavy luggage from the carriage. Coldly confronting the group, Ghislaine dismissed their excuses that she was simply suited for menial work and ordered Vanessa to stop. When the terrified woman hesitated between both parties, Ghislaine firmly declared that he was her only master now and commanded her to ignore everyone else's orders. He then sternly warned Alfoy that Vanessa was his personal mage, and that any future mistreatment would cost the arrogant noble his neck. Deeply humiliated that a lowly maid was being prioritized over the heir of the tower, Alfoy let his rage take over and began releasing a violent, dangerous, magical aura with clear killing intent. In response, Ghislain casually grabbed a wooden spear from a nearby guard, snapped the head off to form a makeshift club, and walked toward him. Before Alfoy could unleash his magic, Ghislain struck him across the face, completely disrupting his mana flow. Ghislain then systematically and ruthlessly beat Alfoy with one hand, perfectly interrupting his spells every time he tried to gather mana, and using the club to strike him back onto his feet whenever he tried to collapse. When the other mages moved to intervene, the surrounding mercenaries instantly drew their weapons and held them at knife point, leaving them pale with fear. Ghislain finally halted the beating, leaving Alfoy broken and kneeling on the ground. Crouching beside him, Ghislain mocked his utter lack of foresight for trying to start a fight on foreign land, while entirely surrounded by over 300 armed men. Although Alfoy furiously threatened to report the physical abuse to the tower and demanded noble respect, Ghislain laughed and pointed out that the tower would always prioritize the contract. He sternly reminded the quieted mages that if they failed to help win this war, the tower would throw them away as rogue actors to protect its own reputation, concluding that they were merely supplementary power sources who needed to behave themselves. Alfoy was deeply humiliated when Ghislain dismissed the mages as nothing more than a reserve mana source, but Ghislain ignored his confusion and ordered them to carry the remaining heavy luggage themselves before he smashed their expensive carriage. Terrified of being left alone with the resentful mages, Vanessa quickly followed Ghislain and the mercenaries toward the castle. As they passed, the mercenaries made mocking comments about the mages' weak bodies and assumed they were just wealthy merchants, completely unaware of their true identities, since the word tower was never mentioned. Alfoy ground his teeth in fury, vowing revenge once he became the tower master. But for now, he had to use a low-level healing spell to fix his bruises so he wouldn't have an excuse to avoid the manual labor. The mages grudgingly began unloading the bulky cargo, which was incredibly heavy because they had packed an entire year's worth of supplies, assuming Vanessa would carry it all. Too proud to use strength-enhancing magic for menial labor, a red-faced Alfoy tried to demand that Belinda summon servants, but she playfully mocked his weakness and refused to cross Ghislain's terrible temper. Just as Alfoy prepared to reluctantly use his mana, Elena and Jillian's healthy daughter, Rachel, arrived with a group of maids. Elena casually lifted several heavy bags, commenting that they weren't heavy at all, which prompted the embarrassed maids and Belinda to rush in and help. With the luggage nearly cleared, the trembling mages were forced to carry the rest, and even their own coachman mocked their lack of exercise, deepening Alfoy's burning hatred for Ghislain. Meanwhile, Ghislain led his forces to the newly constructed mercenary base near the Forest of Beasts, leaving Jillian and Kyra in charge of their training and management. He ensured the troops were provided with top-tier armor and horses out of his own pocket, strictly forbidding them from wasting their equipment on gambling. Ghislain then headed straight to the training grounds to test Vanessa, who nervously admitted that while she couldn't sense mana, she had fully comprehended complex magic theory up to the fifth circle. Impressed by her raw intelligence, Ghislain decided to teach her a specialized mana cultivation technique, overriding her doubts about her past failures by explaining that he would force her to sense mana first. Warning Vanessa to grit her teeth and endure the agonizing process, Ghislain placed his palm against her back and carefully funneled his own mana into her body to temporarily construct a small, artificial mana core. This delicate feat required immense concentration and master-level control, creating a spinning core that forcefully vacuumed in the surrounding mana. Though the foreign energy caused Vanessa excruciating pain, she endured it with a sense of ecstasy, finally feeling the power she had dreamed of all her life. Suddenly, Vanessa fell into a deep trance as the countless fifth circle magic formulas memorized in her mind began reacting violently with the new mana, manifesting more than 5 magic circles simultaneously in the air. Startled by her immediate ability to multicast, Ghislain realized her spells were greedily draining his own energy. But as he tried to safely dial back the flow, Vanessa's hair began turning white from the tips as her body started consuming her own life force to fuel the magic. Realizing the danger, Ghislain cursed, ordered her to snap out of it, and rapidly poured his mana back into her body to save her life. Ghislain carefully cut off the flow of mana inside Vanessa's body, one road at a time, to safely stabilize the flickering, distorted fifth circle magic circles. He realized that if he let go, her life force would be entirely drained. But if he held on, the impending spell would activate and shatter the training hall. Acting quickly, Ghislain completely blocked all her mana paths at once and bellowed for her to open her eyes. The sheer volume of his voice shook the hall, snapping Vanessa out of her trance and causing the countless floating magic circles to vanish. Vanessa doubled over and coughed up blood from the sudden internal turmoil, but she felt a profound sense of euphoria and gratitude because she could finally feel a speck of mana inside her body. Ghislain smiled in satisfaction, admitting he needed her strength for the upcoming war, and promised to teach her a tailored mana cultivation technique. Overwhelmed by his acknowledgement after years of misery, bullying, and neglect as a mere servant at the tower, Vanessa tearfully swore to be of help to him, prompting a cheerful laugh from Ghislain as he welcomed her to his mercenary corps. Under Ghislain's guidance, Vanessa began practicing a modified version of the Ferdium family's secret mana cultivation technique, a taboo choice that would have made the Count and his vassals faint. Because her time to accumulate mana had been brief, her current limit was a fist-sized ball of light from the first circle spell, Light. Though Vanessa worried about her usefulness, Ghislain reassured her that he would handle her lack of mana, warning her that the war would begin within 1 to 2 months. Over the next month and a half, Ghislain balanced his time between training Vanessa, managing his personal conditioning, and checking the road construction in the Forest of Beasts. He also led the 300 mercenaries back into the forest to clear out newly wandering monsters, gathering another large harvest of runestones, while noting that the resource was visibly reducing. Upon his return, the eager vassals stubbornly pestered him for runestones, but he only handed over a small portion due to his secret strategic plans. Ghislain also noticed his physical recovery rate had dramatically improved since his battle with the Blood Python, leaving him uneasy about the mysterious transformation, though he decided to investigate the life-risking truth only after the war. Meanwhile, the new mercenaries grew highly satisfied with their relaxed country lifestyle, high pay, and expensive equipment provided by Ghislain. Since the veteran mercenaries used force to keep everyone in line, the new recruits remained cooperative but privately gossiped that their young commander was overly anxious, believing a territorial war would take at least a year to prepare. They assumed they could simply pull out of the contract before any real invasion happened, enjoying the laid-back routine until a breathless mercenary shattered their peace by running in and shouting that a real war had just begun. Count Diggle suddenly declared war on the Ferdium family under the false pretext of avenging his son, Gilmore Diggle, whom he claimed was killed by Ghislain. While the furious vassals immediately recognized this as a greedy excuse to steal their newly discovered runestones, Chief Overseer Homrain privately lamented that Ghislain's great discovery had rapidly escalated into a disaster. The vassals remained largely unfazed initially because Daigold was historically just as impoverished as Ferdium, whereas Ferdium possessed far more battle-tested soldiers from guarding the northern border. Knight Commander Randolph boldly advocated for a head-on aggressive clash, but a weary Lord Zwalter ordered the estate to switch to a wartime posture, commanding Ghislain to participate alongside his newly hired mercenaries. Zwalter also ordered an immediate assessment of the enemy's strength, confident that their own numbers were superior. 3 days later, a scout's report left the war room in absolute silence. Count Diggle was marching with a staggering 6,000 armed infantry, a 1,000-man supply unit, and numerous heavy siege weapons. Realizing that a poor estate like Diggle could never independently muster a force that featured twice their own army of 2,000 and likely over 50 knights, the vassals deduced that a powerful, wealthy estate was secretly backing the invasion. Panic fractured the room as Homern frantically argued to request external reinforcements while staging a prolonged defense inside the castle, while Randolph fiercely countered that their severe lack of food and defensive weaponry made a siege a slow death sentence. Ghislain watched the chaos coldly, knowing from his past life that Diggle's inclusion of siege weapons meant they intended to completely annihilate the family rather than negotiate a standard territorial settlement. When Zwalter turned to his son for input, Ghislain cautiously suggested requesting reinforcements and holding the castle, though his hidden motive was entirely strategic. He knew from his previous life neighboring lords would completely ignore their pleas, but he needed the estate to adopt a defensive setup so he could execute his own plan to wipe out the enemy with minimal casualties. Zwalter agreed to send out immediate aid requests and ordered all remaining supplies and troops to be transferred from the northern fortress. Over the next 2 weeks, the mood in the estate plummeted into absolute despair as every single neighboring territory, including Raypold, Zimbar, and even Ghislain's brother-in-law Count Rogues, flatly refused to help, realizing that the other lords only cared that someone managed the border and did not care if Diggle took over. Believing his family's lineage was about to end, a visibly aged Zwalter looked at Ghislain's eerily calm, expressionless face and silently hoped his son wouldn't blame himself for the war. Knowing that a defensive siege against heavy weapons would ultimately cause them to starve, and that surrendering to an avenging father meant certain execution, Zwalter fiercely commanded his grim vassals to prepare to meet the enemy outside the walls in a desperate field battle. The vassals silently nodded and followed the count's orders, but as Ghislain quietly walked out of the hall to gather his mercenaries, his expression hardened with cold resolve. Refusing to let his family march into a high-casualty frontal assault, Ghislain decided he would personally take control and force the game to change on his own terms. Knight Commander Randolph planned a brute-force cavalry charge to penetrate the enemy center, relying heavily on his and Lord Zwalter's combat prowess to collapse the massive Diggle army. Recognizing that Ghislain's mercenaries were the only high-quality reinforcement available, Randolph set out to bring them under his supreme command, refusing to let a novice lead such an elite force. However, when he arrived at the northern encampment, he found it completely deserted except for Guard Captain Scovin and a few local soldiers, who explained that Ghislain had suddenly taken all his men and vanished. Panicking, Randolph rushed back to the castle to search for Ghislain's constant companion Belinda, only to discover that his entire inner circle had disappeared alongside the estate's newly mined runestones. Believing that the young lord had smugly stolen the treasury and fled to save his own skin, Randolph furiously exposed the apparent desertion to the War Council. The devastating news that the heir had abandoned his honor devastated Lord Zwalter, who bitterly lamented his son's cowardice while worrying that the shattered morale would render their soldiers entirely unwilling to fight. In the midst of the council's despair, the mages and Vanessa were dragged into the Grand Hall. Chief Overseer Homerin interrogated Alfoy, assuming they were left behind by a fleeing coward, but the arrogant mage openly laughed at the idea, arguing that the crazy young commander was far more likely to recklessly rush into danger than run away. When pressed about Ghislain's final words to her, a tearful Vanessa kept his grander declarations secret, but firmly told the council that the young lord had promised he would win the war. Dismissing her words as meaningless, Zwalter pitied his son's dishonor and allowed the mages to leave, completely unaware of the actual plan. Far from fleeing, Ghislain and his heavily armed mercenaries had spent a full day riding a massive loop around the territory's outskirts to position themselves on a densely forested hill overlooking the enemy's rear lines. Ignoring Belinda's concerns about the risks of fighting separate from the castle, Ghislain explained the true geometry of his strategy. They were positioned to completely cut off the 1,000-man Diggle supply unit. He knew the enemy main force was too blinded by their overwhelming numbers and heavy siege weapons to expect a counter-raid, and deduced that the supply lines would be poorly defended by Diggle's own ragtag troops, rather than the elite reinforcements backing the invasion. As a pitch-black, cloud-covered night settled over the sprawling enemy encampment below, Ghislain confidently accepted a massive, double-edged battle axe from Jillian. His calm, calculated composure eased the tension among his veteran mercenaries as they mounted their restless horses and lowered their spears. With a cold smile, Ghislain issued his final order to take no prisoners and dropped his hand. Baron Favreau, the commander of the Diggle supply unit, spent his evening anticipating the territory he would inherit from the destruction of Ferdium. Taking bribes from Count Desmond, He knew that the massive army marching ahead, disguised as Diggle conscripts but actually composed of reinforcements from Desmond, far outnumbered anything Ferdium could muster. Confident that he was perfectly safe in the rear lines, and eager to reap the political glory of a guaranteed victory, his daydreaming was suddenly interrupted by a low rumbling vibration that shook his tent. Outside, the oblivious knights lazily dismissed the noise as a minor earthquake or a stampeding herd of cattle, completely failing to grasp that an ambush was possible. By the time the cloud-covered darkness erupted with the frantic realization of an assault, Gislin's heavy cavalry was already breaching the perimeter. The unformed, poorly equipped supply troops panicked instantly as horses tore through tents and overturned torches, setting the camp ablaze. One of Diggle's knights spotted Gislin leading the charge and pulled his sword to strike, but upon making eye contact with the young lord's terrifying, crimson-tinged eyes, he froze in sheer dread. With a brutal upward swing of his double-edged battle axe, Gislin split the knight completely in half. As the mercenaries systematically encircled and slaughtered the scattering infantry, Belinda watched Gislin's eerily calm demeanor with growing shock, realizing he was handling the human carnage like a seasoned, cold-blooded warmonger, rather than a novice fighting his first war. Meanwhile, Kyor, the mad dogs, and Jillian hunted down the remaining knights, giving full vent to the bloodlust they had been forced to suppress while fighting for survival in the Forest of Beasts. The lopsided skirmish concluded with over 1,000 Diggle soldiers dead. Jillian dragged a trembling Baron Favreau before Gislin, where the captured noble desperately pleaded for his life, expecting to be ransomed under the customary rights of nobility. Gislin stared down at him with indifferent eyes, noting that Favreau was too insignificant to exist in his past life memories. Rejecting his offer of a ransom and dismissing the concept of noble customs on a battlefield, Gislin brutally executed the Baron with a swift chop of his axe. Back at the castle, the desperate atmosphere was shattered when Gislin and his armored mercenaries marched through the gates, leaving a literal trail of blood on the floor. Drenched from head to toe in gore, but wearing a completely unbothered expression, the once ridiculed young lord now inspired absolute terror in the servants who stepped aside. Gislin kicked open the doors of the Grand Hall where the shocked War Council was still meeting under the assumption that he had deserted. Dropping a blood-soaked box containing Favreau's head onto the center table, Gislin calmly announced that the enemy supply unit had been completely annihilated, declaring that it was finally time to begin the siege. Zwalter and the vassals listened in shock as Gislin calmly detailed how his forces had ambushed the supply unit, burned the cargo, and executed Baron Favreau. Chief Overseer Homern confirmed the identity of the severed head, which left Knight Commander Randolph completely stunned, realizing that the young lord now exuded the terrifying aura of a seasoned butcher. When a flustered Zwalter scolded him for launching such a high-risk, unauthorized operation, Gislin coldly defended his secrecy, pointing out that a traitor had already compromised the estate and that he trusted absolutely no one but himself. Gislin unilaterally declared that the territory must switch to a strict siege defense, forbidding anyone from leaving the fortress under penalty of his own blade. He explained the tactical logic. With their supply unit annihilated, the enemy's 6,000-strong main army could not sustain itself for more than a few days, giving the defenders a massive advantage if they could endure for at least a week. While Zwalter and the retainers agreed with the strategy and prepared to send another plea for aid to Count Rogues, Gislin coldly mentioned a secondary ruthless option, abandoning the civilians to retreat to the fortified northern fortress, a suggestion that drew furious noble outrage from Zwalter. Ultimately, Zwalter committed to holding Ferdium Castle and preparing the layout of their forces. Refusing to let his mercenaries be absorbed into the main territorial army, Gislin demanded sole command of the castle gate, framing it as a strategic position to deploy highly mobile reinforcements wherever the defensive lines fractured. When a frustrated Albert demanded to know where the newly mined runestones were hidden, Gislin cryptically replied that he had already spent them all where they were needed before walking out of the Grand Hall. In reality, Gislin knew that Count Rogues would never send reinforcements because the cut communication lines meant the estate was already isolated. He had recognized the insignia on the enemy forces and knew that Count Diggle was merely a puppet for the true mastermind, the supreme commander of the Northern Army, Duke Harold Desmond. Gislin understood that holding the weak walls of the castle against Desmond's brutal siege weapons was practically impossible. While he possessed the secret magical advantage of the six-tower mages to launch a potentially devastating flank attack, a standard victory would still result in Pyrrhic high-casualty losses. Resolving to protect his forces, Gislin prepared to execute a final devastating trap to make a permanent, terrifying example out of anyone who dared threaten Ferdium. Count Tamos Digald was thrown into a furious panic upon hearing of the total annihilation of his supply unit. He fiercely blamed the deceased Baron Favreau for the catastrophic failure, realizing that without the supply trains, his 6,000-strong army could not sustain a prolonged siege. To make matters worse, the lost supply line contained the vast majority of the stones intended for their heavy catapults. However, Count Desmond's elite commander Victor calmly dismissed the Count's anxiety, noting that their massive siege towers and main infantry forces remained completely intact to breach the walls. Victor reassured Tamos that the siege would be swift, privately harboring absolute contempt for the cowardly Count and secretly plotting to have him killed during the chaos so Desmond could easily manipulate Digald's secondary heir. Victor confidently guaranteed that the Ferdium estate would fall long before Count Rogues could deliver reinforcements. Farther down the territory's paths, Amelia had already established a strict blockade, intercepting and killing every single messenger Lord Zwalter desperately dispatched toward the Rogues' estate. While lounging in her tent with her cat Bastet, Amelia viewed Ferdium's noble determination to protect its citizens behind weak walls as an absurdly inefficient, sentimental death pact. She reasoned that a proper commander would have abandoned the castle to wage a brutal guerrilla campaign instead. However, when news reached Amelia that the Digald supply lines had been completely wiped out in a high-risk ambush, a sharp sense of foreboding nagged at her. Knowing that neither the straightforward Count Zwalter nor the hot-headed Knight Commander Randolph possessed the reckless, gambling nature required to pull off such a dangerous stunt, she instantly deduced the culprit. Amelia ordered Bernarf to deploy more scouts closer to the battlefield, certain that the madman Gislin was already orchestrating an unimaginable trap behind the fortress gates. The Digald army arrived at Ferdium and immediately began assembling their siege weapons, quickly completing 4 massive siege towers and a single catapult. Though the enemy's supply lines had been cut, they ruthlessly bypassed the traditional custom of demanding an honorable surrender and opened fire. The single catapult decimated a large section of Ferdium's flimsy walls until its limited ammunition ran out, leaving the rubble piled high enough for infantry to easily climb. With war drums pounding, the 6,000-strong army advanced. Victor, the elite commander representing Count Desmond, deployed 2 massive water-soaked siege towers to the flanks. Despite Lord Zwalter and Knight Commander Randolph's fierce resistance on the ramparts, the sheer disparity in numbers quickly began to wear down the defenders. Recognizing that Ferdium's forces were dangerously fractured, Victor ordered his central infantry to storm the newly collapsed section of the wall. Desperate to plug the breach, Zwalter bellowed down to the courtyard, commanding Gislin to take his heavily armored mercenaries and hold the broken wall. Gislin, whose troops were wrapped in mysterious black armor coverings, flatly refused the order. Instead, as the enemy's central force prepared to move, Gislin shocked Guard Captain Scovin by ordering the castle's main gate to be thrown wide open. Both Zwalter and Randolph looked down from the ramparts in absolute horror, screaming at the young lord to close the gate and obey his commander. Ignoring their panicked shouts, Gislin tightened his grip on his massive 2-handed battle axe, lowered his black visor, and told a bewildered Scovin that the best defense is a good offense. With a terrifying red light flickering from his eyes, Gislin channeled mana into his legs and blasted out of the open gate at incredible speed, launching a direct, suicidal charge into the heart of the enemy army.